I looked out the window, watching the clouds slowly part, revealing the familiar shape of the Miami coastline. A familiar route, this time from Singapore, where I had spent the last 2 weeks negotiating the details of a new contract. My Boeing began its descent, and somewhere below me waited our cozy home in Coral Gables, one of those respectable neighborhoods where neighbors say hello to each other in the morning, and letter carriers know all the residents by name. I pulled out my phone, about to text Evelyn, but stopped myself. I wanted to surprise her. After all, I was back a day earlier than planned. A rare stroke of luck in my life of endless flights and meetings. For the past 8 years, every return home has been like a breath of fresh air. Evelyn always greeted me with that special smile that made me forget about the 55 years behind me and feel like I was 30 again. The plane landed exactly on schedule, at 14:30. I never travel with much luggage. Years had taught me to pack the bare minimum of necessities in the small leather suitcase Evelyn had given me for our first anniversary. She had engraved my initials on the metal plate, LK, Lawrence Kingsley. My friends always call me Larry, but Evelyn likes the full name. There's something aristocratic about it, she says, and I don't argue. In the arrivals hall, I head toward the cab stand on automatic, but I stop. Instead of my usual route home, I decided to stop first at Vinyl Heaven, the record store on Collins Avenue that my old buddy Jim has kept for over 20 years. I've been collecting vinyl since the 70s, especially the Rolling Stones. It's been with me since college, when my friends and I would spend evenings listening to Sticky Fingers and dreaming of one day seeing the legendary band live. The cab slowly made its way through the packed streets of Miami. I looked at the palm trees swaying in the warm spring breeze and thought about how my life had changed in recent years. After my painful divorce from Rachel, I was sure I'd never decide to pursue a serious relationship again. 15 years of marriage ended when she decided she could no longer live with a man who spent more time on airplanes than at home, and then Evelyn showed up. It happened at the Ocean View Tennis Club, where I go every weekend when I'm in town. She came to replace her friend in doubles play. I remember when she missed the ball and laughed, easily and infectiously, without a shadow of embarrassment. In her 35 years, she radiated some special vitality. I learned that she worked at a private clinic nearby, specializing in pediatrics. "Kids don't lie," she had said then, explaining her choice of profession. Jim greeted me as always, with a cup of espresso and news of rare finds. His store is a veritable Aladdin's cave for fanatics like me. Vintage posters on the walls, racks full of records, and that special smell of old vinyl that you can't mistake for anything else. "Larry, you have to see this." He pulled out an envelope signed by Keith Richards. We spent half an hour discussing the latest news about a possible Stones tour. "Word is they're coming to Miami this fall," Jim said, and I felt a familiar excitement. Maybe I'd get lucky with tickets this time. When I finally came out of the store, it was the beginning of 5. I was holding a bag with a couple of new acquisitions, a reissue of Beggar's Banquet and a jazz album that Evelyn would love. She likes to turn on jazz when she reads her endless medical journals in the evenings. The cab driver, an elderly Cuban with silver whiskers, talked about his grandchildren all the way to the salsa rhythms from the radio. I stared at the storefronts floating by, thinking I should make a reservation at Evelyn's favorite restaurant, a little French bistro 2 blocks away. It serves the best onion soup in town, and the maitre d' always keeps a table for us by the window. Our house is 2 stories, Mediterranean style, with terracotta tiles and a small garden where Evelyn grows orchids. I love this house. We bought it a year after we got married, and every room holds some special memory. The library on the 2nd floor, where I collect Hemingway first editions. The kitchen with a huge window where we often have breakfast on weekends. The living room with an old record player and my vinyl collection. The car pulled up in front of the house at 6:15. I paid, adding a generous tip. The good mood needed a way out. Evelyn's car was in the driveway, the white Volvo I'd given her last Christmas, so she was home already, probably home early from work. I pulled out my keys about to open the door but noticed it wasn't locked. Evelyn sometimes forgot to lock the lock when she was in a hurry. I smiled, imagining her surprised face when she saw me a day early. The hallway was unusually quiet. Usually there was music coming from the living room at this time, Evelyn liked to play her endless TV shows in the background while she did chores. I set the suitcase carefully by the door, trying not to make any noise. I put the bag of records next to it. There was a light scent of her favorite perfume in the air, the French perfume I'd brought back from my last trip to Paris. Mixed with something else. Tobacco? Strange. Neither Evelyn nor I smoke. A muffled laugh came from somewhere upstairs. A man's voice. I froze in place, feeling the ground slipping from under my feet. The sound of footsteps on the stairs. I stood in the hallway, unable to move, as if I'd burrowed into the expensive Persian rug we'd bought for our wedding anniversary last year. Evelyn had spent a long time choosing a pattern, saying something about matching the wallpaper. God, what did it matter now? The man's laughter came again, closer, more distinct. Time stretched like rubber. I stared at the family photos on the wall, dozens of happy moments in expensive frames. Our wedding in the botanical gardens, our honeymoon in the Maldives, Christmas dinner with her parents. It all seemed so distant, so unreal. My throat was dry, and my blood pounded in my temples with a deafening rumble. I took a step toward the stairs, then another. My shiny Oxfords, the result of a long wait at the Singapore airport, now seemed impossibly heavy. The banister under my arm was cool, the polished wood bearing the marks of 1,000 touches. How many times had I walked down those stairs in the morning, anticipating breakfast with Evelyn? There were 5 doors on the second floor. A bedroom, my office, a library, a guest room, and a bathroom. I knew every chink in the wood floor, every crack in the ceiling. There was a Monet reproduction hanging here in the hallway, a housewarming gift from my friend Chris. Water Lilies was Evelyn's favorite painting. She could talk for hours about the Impressionists. The voices came from the bedroom, our bedroom, the light blue walls that Evelyn had chosen so carefully, saying it was a soothing color. The huge bed with the carved headboard I'd found it at an antique market in New Orleans. Evelyn had said then that it was fate to find such beauty by chance. The door was ajar. A thin strip of light fell on the parquet, like a golden blade cutting my world into, before and after. I could hear them talking, muffled voices, laughter, the rustle of sheets. The very Egyptian sheets that Evelyn had ordered specially from Alexandria. "Lawrence, you have no idea how soft they are," she had raved then. My fingers touched the doorknob. The cold metal burned my skin. Time slowed down even more. I saw every speck of dust in the beam of light, heard every beat of my heart. Somewhere downstairs, a floor clock was ticking, an antique Howard Miller, another flea market find we'd shared. Evelyn loved things like that, with history, with soul. I pushed the door open. The hinges didn't squeak. I'd oiled them myself last week, before I left for Singapore. The first thing I saw was a scattering of clothes. Evelyn's white robe, the one monogrammed with the clinic's monogram. A man's jacket, dark blue, expensive looking. Shoes, polished, like mine. They didn't notice me right away. Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a silk robe, pale pink, my birthday present. Her dark hair was loose, her lipstick a little smudged, and beside her stood he, a tall man in his 40s, already wearing pants but no shirt. Trim, tanned, probably tennis or golf on the weekends. That kind of man. There was silence. Thick, viscous, like tar. I could hear a car passing somewhere outside, birds chirping in the garden, water dripping in the bathroom, the faucet I was going to fix when I got back. All so ordinary, so normal, as if the world wasn't falling apart. "Lawrence." Evelyn's voice trembled. She'd never called me Larry, not even now. "You were supposed to be back tomorrow." A man, I recognized him now, Dr. Holloway from her clinic, a surgeon, I think, was hastily pulling on a shirt. His hands trembled slightly, buttons missing their buttonholes. His expensive cufflinks gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, gold, intricately engraved. "Brad, you'd better leave," Evelyn said without looking at him. Her fingers nervously rubbed the waistband of her robe. Holloway nodded, smoothing back his disheveled hair. He tried to say something, but I held up my hand to stop him. Words were unnecessary. He walked past me, catching my shoulder-expensive perfume, the same scent I'd smelled downstairs. On the stairs, his footsteps sounded rumbling, unnaturally loud in the ringing silence of the house. The front door slammed. I heard the engine start. His car must have been parked around the corner. Smart. Prudent. I wondered how long they'd been planning this. How often was this happening while I was flying around the world earning our happiness? Lawrence, I can explain. Evelyn stood up, taking a step toward me. Her eyes were moist, but I couldn't tell if it was from shame or fear, or maybe from relief that everything had finally been revealed. I stared at our bedroom, so familiar and so foreign at the same time. The picture from our wedding on the bedside table. The book Evelyn had read before bed, some kind of medical journal. My cufflinks in a little china cup. She always put them in there when she put shirts away in the wash. "Pack your things." My voice sounded foreign, somehow mechanical. "Right now." "But where am I going to go?" She wrapped her arms around herself as if she were freezing. The room was indeed cool. The air conditioner was on full blast, just the way she liked it. To my parents' place, to the hotel, anywhere. I turned toward the door. "You've got an hour." I went downstairs, making my way into the kitchen. Everything in here breathed her presence. A cup of unfinished coffee on the table, an open journal, a note on the refrigerator with a shopping list in her neat handwriting. There were 2 wine glasses in the sink. They must have been drinking wine before they went upstairs. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I pulled out my cell phone. I should have called Chris. He'd understand. He'd been through this. But my fingers wouldn't listen. There was a lump in my throat, and the only thought pulsing in my head was, how could I have been so blind? There were sounds coming from upstairs. Evelyn was packing. The rustling of clothes, the clanging of closet doors, the tinkling of hangers. Each sound echoed in her head like a hammer blow. 8 years. 8 years of life, of plans, of hopes. I stood up, walked over to the bar. My hands trembled as I poured the whiskey, an 18-year-old Macallan, a gift from the board of directors last Christmas. Evelyn had said then that it was too expensive a gift to drink just for fun. "It needs a special occasion," she said. Well, the special occasion came. I spent almost an hour in the kitchen listening to Evelyn upstairs packing. The whiskey in my glass was melting with the ice, but I hadn't taken a sip. Images of the past floated before my eyes, vivid as images from an old movie. There was Evelyn on the day we first met. White tennis skirt, windswept hair, radiant smile. Then she spilled orange juice on my new shirt and was embarrassed, and for some reason I thought it was the most adorable sight in the world. The front door slammed. Evelyn left without a word. Maybe she should have. What words could there be? I went upstairs to the bedroom. The closet was open, empty inside. She'd taken about half of her things. On the dressing table was her favorite tortoiseshell comb, a gift from her grandmother. Had she forgotten or left it behind on purpose? The scent of her perfume, mixed with Holloway's, still lingered in the air. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from Chris. Probably wanted to discuss the tennis game tomorrow. We've played every Saturday for over a decade now, unless I'm on a business trip. Chris Donovan's been my best friend since college. He's the one who introduced me to my first wife, Rachel. I hadn't thought about her in years. Our marriage lasted 15 years and ended quietly, without drama or scandal. "We've just become strangers, Larry," she said then. "You live on airplanes and I live here. It's not a life." I didn't argue. She was right. Work always came first. Building a career, earning a dream house, securing a future. Isn't that what every man dreams of? The phone buzzed. Chris again. This time I answered it. "Larry, where have you been? I thought you were in Singapore till tomorrow." "Back early." My voice sounded hoarse. "Chris, can you come over?" There was a pause. Chris knew me too well. He didn't need an explanation. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Buy anything on the way?" "No, just show up." I went downstairs to the living room. Everything in here breathed of our life together. The pictures on the walls, the vinyl record collection, her favorite chair by the window where she often read in the evenings. On the coffee table lay an unread book, some medical reference book with a bookmark in the middle. Next to it was a cup of cold coffee and a packet of her favorite cookies. such simple, homely details that now caused almost physical pain. My gaze fell on the photograph on the mantel, our first trip to Europe together. We'd spent 2 weeks in France then, touring all the wineries of Bordeaux. Evelyn had fallen in love with the small towns of Provence, saying she wanted to buy a house there someday. Imagine, Lawrence, we could spend summers there when you retire. The doorbell rang, snapping me out of my memories. Chris was standing on the doorstep with a bottle of whiskey, that same 18-year-old Macallan. He always knew what was needed at times like this. "Tell me about it," he said, walking into the house. We settled into my study, the only room in the house that showed no sign of Evelyn's presence. It smelled of leather and wood and old books, my world, my order, my sanctuary. Chris silently poured whiskey into glasses while I recounted what had happened. He didn't interrupt, only nodded occasionally, twirling the glass in his hands. "Holloway." He stretched out thoughtfully when I finished. "Know him, plays golf at our club. Good surgeon, they say." "What does it matter now?" I finished my whiskey in a gulp. My throat burned, but the pain was almost pleasant, at least some feeling other than the dull emptiness inside. "Remember what you said to me when I divorced Jane?" Chris poured another glass. "You said, 'Sometimes a loss is a new beginning.' Wise words, Larry." I remembered that conversation. It was 5 years ago, right when Evelyn and I bought this house. Jane had gone to her yoga coach, and Chris hadn't left the house for a week. I brought him whiskey and pizza then, and we sat up all night listening to old records by the Rolling Stones. You know what the lousy part is? I got up and walked over to the window. It was getting dark outside the glass. The lights were on in the neighboring houses. I really believed things were different for us, didn't I? That after Rachel, I'd finally found the one, the real thing. Chris was silent. What could he say? All those phrases about time heals and it's all for the best seemed so empty and meaningless. "Remember when you introduced me to Rachel?" I turned to him. "The college graduation party. She wore a blue dress and laughed at all my stupid jokes. And you were wearing that awful polka dot tie," Chris grinned. "And hopelessly in love at first sight." 15 years, I shook my head. 15 years, and it's all gone to shit. And now this? 8 years with Evelyn. Maybe there's something wrong with me? Maybe I'm just not cut out for married life? Come on, Chris set the glass on the table. You just work too hard. Always have been working. Remember what Rachel said before she left? Of course I remembered. Every word crashed into my memory. You've built a wonderful life, Larry. It's just too bad you're barely in it. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from Evelyn. I'm at my parents' house. We need to talk when you're ready. I showed the screen to Chris. And what are you going to do? I have no idea. I sat back in my chair. You know what the funny thing is? I have Rolling Stones concert tickets in my suitcase. Got them through an acquaintance in Singapore. I wanted to surprise her. For that concert in October? Chris whistled. It's impossible to get tickets. There's an extra one now. I grinned bitterly. Why don't you come with me? Just like old times? No chance. Chris raised his glass. Here's to new beginnings? I nodded and clinked my glass with his. It was finally dark outside the window, and the glass reflected our silhouettes, two old friends with glasses of whiskey, just like 30 years ago, just more wrinkles and gray hair. You know, Chris said after a long silence, maybe you should take a vacation. Go somewhere, get away from it all. I mean, you've got tons of days saved up. I shook my head. Not now. I need to figure things out first. Figure out how long this has been going on, and most importantly, why. And do you really need that? To know all the details? Good question. Do I really need to know how often they met? Where? What they talked about? Did she laugh at his jokes the way she once laughed at mine? Or was it better to leave it at that, put a stop to it and move on? But I knew I couldn't. Too many questions, too many inconsistencies. Now, looking back, I was starting to notice the little things, her late returns from work, unexpected weekend meetings, new jewelry whose origins she explained vaguely. You know what? Chris stood up. Let's go to the club. Let's play a game of tennis. You need to blow off some steam. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 o'clock at night. But Chris was right. Sitting at home reliving memories was the worst possible option. Just let's not go to Ocean View, I said, standing up. I don't want to meet people I know there. Let's go to that new club on the coast. Chris nodded. He understood everything without words. That's why I valued our friendship. While I was getting changed, he called and booked the court. Tennis had always been our way of coping. Maybe a couple hours with a racket would help clear my head and find some way out of this nightmare. The morning started with a headache. Chris stayed the night in the guest room. After tennis and whiskey, neither of us were in any condition to drive. I went down to the kitchen where he was already conjuring up the coffee machine. Evelyn's last birthday present to me. You spend too much on instant coffee at airports, she said then. It's time to learn how to make a proper espresso. Chris handed me a cup. I caught my reflection in the chrome surface of the coffee machine. A wrinkled face, red eyes, stubble. Not at all like a successful manager of a multinational company. How's your shoulder? He asked, cracking eggs into a frying pan. After yesterday's game, my whole body was aching. We'd been on the court for almost 3 hours, and I'd played like a man possessed until I started missing even the simplest of serves. It'll get over it. I took a sip of coffee. Too hot, too strong. Evelyn always added a little milk, knowing exactly the proportions. Hell, even the morning coffee reminded me of her now. The phone vibrated, a message from the secretary. Mr. Kingsley, the Singapore contract meeting has been rescheduled for Thursday. Can I send you an updated schedule? Work, right. The real world still existed. You need to go to the clinic, Chris said suddenly, placing a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. Talk to her coworkers. Maybe they know something. I shook my head. I don't want to cause a scene. Who said anything about making a scene? Just walk in like you're waiting for Evelyn. Look at the reaction of the staff. Sometimes silence is more eloquent than words. His words made sense. Besides, I had to pick up Evelyn's papers from her office. She'd sent a message last night with that request. Just the work papers, Lawrence. I'll pick up the rest of your things later. The clinic greeted me with its familiar bustle. I'd been here dozens of times, meeting Evelyn after her shift, dropping off things I'd forgotten at home. Sometimes we had lunch together in the little cafe on the first floor. The nurse at the front desk, Carol, if I remembered her name correctly, smiled welcomingly. Mr. Kingsley, and Dr. Evelyn isn't coming in today. She called this morning, took the morning off. I know, I interrupted her. She asked me to pick up some papers from her office. Something flashed in Carol's eyes. Anxiety? Sympathy? Did she know? Did everyone here know? The thought made her uncomfortable. Everything in Evelyn's office was the same as usual. Perfect order on the desk, framed photos. Hours together, I noticed bitterly. A stack of medical journals. A date was marked on the calendar. A week from today. Some conference in Boston. Had she told me about it? I don't think so. I was gathering my papers when there was a knock on the door. Dr. Sarah Cohen was an elderly pediatrician who'd worked at the clinic for over 20 years. She was friends with Evelyn, often coming over for dinner with her husband. Larry. She hesitated in the doorway. Evelyn called this morning. You knew? The question burst out on its own. Sarah lowered her eyes, and that was more eloquent than any answer. Have a seat. She closed the door and pointed to the visitor's chair. Listen, there's something I have to tell you. My heart beat faster. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it, but I sat down nonetheless. Sarah settled herself across from me, nervously adjusting her glasses, a gesture I remembered from all our previous encounters. It didn't start yesterday, she spoke softly, as if afraid we'd be overheard. Brad, Dr. Holloway transferred to us about a year ago. He and Evelyn hit it off right away. At first, it seemed like a normal professional interaction, but then, a year ago. I tried to remember what was going on in our lives then. I think I was just closing out a major contract in Japan, practically living on an airplane between Tokyo and Miami. Evelyn said she missed me, but she was supportive. At least, that's what I thought. There were others? The words scratched my throat. Sarah averted her gaze. I'm not sure. I mean, there were rumors. Before Brad. You see, in the medical community, everyone knows each other. I raised my hand, stopping her. That's enough. Enough. My head was spinning. The room seemed to sway before my eyes. There was a picture on Evelyn's desk, a picture of us in Paris last spring. I'd flown up for the weekend to surprise her. We had dinner in a small restaurant near Notre Dame, walked along the promenade. She seemed so happy then. Or was that a game too? Thanks, Sarah. I stood up, gathering my papers. I gotta go. Larry, she stood up too. I know it's none of my business, but Evelyn really loved you. It's just that sometimes people get lonely. I walked out of the office without finishing listening. The hallway was stuffy, the sterile hospital air pressing against my temples. As I passed the resident's office, I heard a snippet of conversation. With Holloway, long overdue. His wife finally found out. The voices died down as I passed by. I found myself alone in the elevator. 8 floors down seemed like an eternity. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall, my suit wrinkled, my tie bunched up. The file folder I clutched to my chest contained proof that the last 8 years of my life had been built on lies. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long time, unable to start the engine. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Evelyn and a message. We need to talk, please. What was she trying to say? That everything was a mistake? That she's sorry? That she loved me? But I was working too hard? It all seemed so empty, so pointless. I started the car and drove out of the parking lot. I turned on the radio at a stoplight, and the Rolling Stones were playing Wild Horses. Evelyn had never understood my love for them. They're so old, Lawrence, she'd say. Why don't you listen to something modern? Or maybe that was a lie, too. Maybe she was just pretending to be interested in my hobbies. I didn't feel like driving home. I parked near the beach and sat for a long time, staring at the ocean. The waves were crashing on the shore with a monotonous noise. Seagulls circled over the water. Life went on. The world didn't stop, although my personal world lay in ruins. My phone vibrated again. This time a message from Chris. How are you? Meet me at the club tonight? I started to type a reply, but stopped. What could I say? That I'd learned about the existence of a parallel universe where my wife was a completely different person. That the last year of my life had been a farce played out behind my back. Instead of answering, I dialed my assistant's number. Jake, cancel all appointments for next week. Yes, including the Singapore contract. Let Davidson handle it. No, I'm not sick. Just got some personal stuff to take care of. Then I called Chris. Remember what you said about vacation? Maybe you were right. I spent most of the day on the beach, wandering aimlessly along the water's edge. My cell phone was dead, thank God. I didn't feel like talking to anyone, answering messages, pretending everything was fine. The sun was slowly slipping towards sunset, coloring the ocean in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in the distance, music was playing, I think from the beach bar where Evelyn and I sometimes went on Fridays. I got home when it was dark. There was an envelope in the mailbox, a utility bill for Mrs. Evelyn Kingsley. It was such a small thing, it turned me upside down. I wondered how many more of these envelopes would come before she changed her address, and what to do with her name on the deeds to the house, the insurance, the bank accounts. The house was quiet and stuffy. I turned on the air conditioner, but the smell of her perfume seemed to be embedded in the walls, in the furniture, in every damn thing around me. The red light on the answering machine was blinking 3 new messages. The first was from my sister Mary. Larry, you're not answering your phone. Evelyn called me. Please call me back. The other 2 from Evelyn, I erased them without listening. There was still half a bottle of Macallan left on the bar. I poured myself 2 fingers, but I didn't drink it. I just watched the light of the table lamp play in the amber liquid. I remembered how Evelyn and I had picked out that lamp in an antique store in New Orleans. She'd fallen in love with the stained glass lampshade with lilies, and I'd teased her, saying it was too pretentious. Now every little thing like that resonated with pain. The house phone rang. The number for Evelyn's parents came up on the caller ID. I watched the screen blink until it stopped ringing. What could I say to Margaret and Gerald Porter? I'm sorry, but your daughter is not who I thought she was for the past 8 years? The refrigerator was filled with lasagna Evelyn had prepared. She always cooked ahead of my business trips. A note on the container in her handwriting: heat on medium for 7 minutes. Love you. I slammed the refrigerator door shut with such force that the bottles on the shelves rang. Walking up to my office, I turned on my laptop. My email was pouring over unread messages. Work is not waiting. The world keeps turning. I opened the folder with photos. Why? Masochism. Here we are in Venice last summer. Evelyn in a straw hat feeding pigeons in Piazza San Marco. And this is Christmas at her parents' house. She's in a funny reindeer sweater, helping her mother decorate the tree. New Year's Eve in Aspen. Her first attempts at skiing. Her laughter as she falls into the snow. I accidentally opened a folder with last year's photos from a corporate party at the clinic. I couldn't go then. I was in Tokyo. In one of the pictures, Evelyn is standing next to Holloway. Just co-workers, nothing special. But now I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The way she was leaning slightly toward him. The way she was smiling. And that was back then, a year ago. My cell phone rang, finally charged. Chris. Where have you been? I stopped by your place this afternoon. I was at the beach, thinking. So, did you come up with anything? You know? I leaned back in my chair, staring out the darkness outside the window. I keep trying to figure out exactly when things went wrong. Maybe if I worked less, or been home more often, or… Whoa, Chris interrupted. Don't start that self-incrimination crap. It's not your fault she decided to seek adventure on the side. Sarah said there were others, before Holloway. There was a pause. I heard Chris sigh heavily. I'm sorry, man. Really sorry. You know what the lousy part is? I still love her. Or rather, the woman I thought she was. Who the hell never existed? Something rustled in the receiver. Then Chris said, Get dressed. I'll pick you up in half an hour. Chris, I'm not in the mood. That's exactly why I'm picking you up. There's a jazz night at the club tonight. Remember Mike from the tennis section? He plays the saxophone. You need to unwind. I wanted to say no, but I knew he was right. Sitting at home surrounded by memories was the worst option. While I was changing, the phone rang again. Evelyn's number. My finger hovered over the receive button. What did she want? Explain herself? To apologize? To say it was all a mistake? I imagined her voice, so familiar, so beloved. No, not yet. The Blue Note was in an old Art Deco building on Ocean Drive, my and Evelyn's favorite jazz venue. Hell, why did everything in this town have to remind me of her? Chris parked in the usual spot. We often came here on Fridays. It was smoky and crowded inside. The familiar bartender, Tony, I think, nodded at me. Long time no see, Mr. Kingsley, the usual? I nodded. The usual meant a double scotch without ice. Evelyn always teased me about my conservatism in my drink choices. Mike and his quartet were playing something from the old Coltrane repertoire. The music enveloped me, filled the emptiness inside. I watched the saxophonist's fingers fly across the keys and tried not to think about anything. Not to remember how Evelyn and I had danced here to this same tune, how she'd laid her head on my shoulder, how her hair smelled. Larry? A woman's voice snapped me out of my memories. Jennifer Parker, the anesthesiologist from the clinic, was standing next to me. She often worked with Evelyn on the same shift. Hi, Jenny. I tried to smile. I could tell by the look in her eyes. She knew. The whole clinic probably knew by now. I'm really sorry. Yeah, thanks. I took a sip of scotch. How long have you known? She faltered, rubbing her napkin. Larry, I don't think… Just tell me, please. It started before Brad, she said quietly. There was a Dr. Ramirez from cardiology, but he transferred to another clinic. Then… I'm not supposed to say that. Then? Remember the conference in Chicago last fall? Evelyn went with Dr. Stevens. I stop her. Chicago, of course. She called every night, talking about boring reports, saying she missed me. And I was busy, stuck in meetings, giving one-word answers. I'm sorry, Jennifer touched my arm. I should have told you sooner, but we were all thinking, Hoped she'd come to her senses. You're a good man, Larry. I finished my scotch in a gulp. The music suddenly seemed too loud, the air too thick. I should have stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. You know, Jennifer was quiet. Maybe you should talk to her, hear her side of the story. Why? To hear another lie? No, to let go. Sometimes you need to hear the truth, no matter how bitter, to move on. I looked at her. She was right. But I wasn't sure I was ready for that truth. Not now, when every new revelation was like a knife to the heart. Chris appeared as if out of nowhere, putting a hand on my shoulder. Let's go home, man. That's enough for today. I was silent in the car, watching the lights of the city go by. Miami lived its usual nightlife. The music from the bars, the laughter of the tourists, the sound of the surf. And I felt like a ghost, stuck between a past that never existed and a future that now seemed empty and meaningless. You know what? Chris said suddenly. Screw this whole thing. Let's go down to Key West for the weekend. We'll take the boat, go fishing, just like old times. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the window. Maybe it really was a good idea to get away, if only for a little while. To get away from the memories, from the sympathetic looks, from having to make decisions. At home, I sat on the veranda in the dark for a long time, listening to the cicadas and the noise of the air conditioner. The phone was silent. Perhaps Evelyn had finally realized that I wasn't ready to talk. On the table was the magazine she'd been reading the morning I'd left for Singapore. The bookmark was still on the same page. I wondered if she had finished it. Or was she too busy meeting with Holloway? Jennifer's words about needing to hear the truth swirled around in her head. Maybe she was right. Maybe I should meet with Evelyn, ask all these questions that were plaguing me. But something told me I wasn't ready to hear the answers. Not yet. The wound is still too fresh, and each new revelation only makes it worse. The trip to Key West didn't happen. Friday morning, Margaret, Evelyn's mother, called. Her voice sounded unaccustomedly formal. Lawrence, we need to meet. Evelyn wants to talk. We could arrange to meet on neutral ground. The neutral ground turned out to be Le Petit Jardin, a French patisserie in Coral Gables where Evelyn and I often had breakfast on weekends. The owner, Madame Dupré, always kept a table for us in the garden, away from the tourists. Evelyn loved their croissants with almonds and cinnamon coffee. I arrived half an hour early. It's a habit developed over years of business meetings to always be first. Madame Dupré, seeing me alone, only nodded understandingly. News travels fast in a small town. Your usual table, Monsieur Kingsley? She spoke with a slight French accent, even though she'd lived in Miami for 20 years. No, better inside. I didn't want to sit in our usual spot. Too many memories. A small table by the window, a starched tablecloth, fresh flowers in a vase. Everything was the same as always, but everything was different. I ordered only coffee, my throat constricted at the thought of food. On the wall opposite hung a painting, a copy of Renoir, Couples Dancing. Evelyn and I loved to dance too, especially after a glass of wine. She always said I had a good sense of rhythm for someone who only listened to 70s rock. She showed up exactly at the appointed time. Accuracy was always her strong suit. She was wearing the blue dress I'd brought from Milan and pearl earrings, my 5th wedding anniversary present. Evelyn looked tired, with shadows under her eyes. I wondered if she was up at night too. Lawrence, she paused at the table, tentatively rubbing the strap of her purse. Thanks for agreeing to meet. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Madame Dupré materialized beside me with her invariable notebook. The usual, madam? Coffee with cinnamon and an almond croissant? Just coffee, thank you. Evelyn sat up, straightening the non-existent creases in her dress. Her hands trembled slightly. We were silent until the coffee arrived. Evelyn added milk, 1 spoonful as always. Such a familiar habit. I'm staying with my parents, she finally said. Dad, he's very upset. Really? I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. Gerald Porter, a retired Marine colonel, had always prided himself on his principles. I wondered what he thought of his daughter's principles. Lawrence, please. She looked up. I know you're angry. You have a right to be. But we must talk. About what? About how long this has been going on. About how long before Holloway. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. You know? I know now. It's amazing how many people suddenly decided to share information. Ramirez, Stevens, who else, Evelyn? She lowered her head, her fingers clutching the cup. I didn't mean to hurt you. Really? What did you want to do? To have fun while your husband's away on business? To feel young and desirable? No, it's not like that. She fell silent, choosing her words. I did love you, Lawrence. I still do. It's just what? Have I been working too hard? Spent too little time at home? Go ahead, say it. Say it's my fault. At a neighboring table, an elderly couple carefully pretended not to listen to our conversation. Madame Dupre loomed at the counter, ostentatiously wiping the already clean cups. No, it's not that. Evelyn pulled a handkerchief out of her purse, the monogrammed one I'd brought her from Paris. I got confused. When Mark showed up, Dr. Ramirez, it was like an obsession. I didn't plan it, it just happened, and then you got a taste for it. I pushed the cup away. The coffee was getting cold, and I wasn't thirsty either. It's not fair. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. I know I betrayed you. I know I ruined everything. But I want to make it right. We could… What? Start over? Pretend it never happened? Or should I just turn a blind eye to your fun? Brad doesn't work at the clinic anymore, she said quietly, almost a whisper. He transferred to Tampa. It's over between us. And the next one? When I leave on my business trip again. Who will be next, Evelyn? She shuddered. Outside the window, it had begun to rain. A typical Miami afternoon downpour. Droplets hit the glass, creating bizarre patterns. Thunder rumbled from somewhere. I could change jobs, she said quickly, like she was afraid I'd interrupt. We could move to another city, start over. Why? So you can do it all over again a year from now? No, I swear, Lawrence. I realized my mistake. These days without you, I can't live like this. I looked at her, so beautiful, so familiar. For 8 years I'd woken up next to this woman, shared dreams, plans, hopes with her. I knew every feature of her face, every intonation of her voice. Or did I just think I did? And how have you lived all these years? When you went out with them and then came home and kissed me? When you accepted the gifts I brought back from my trips? When you planned our vacations knowing you'd just been with someone else? Come on. I know I'm guilty. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I love you, Lawrence. I really do. Love you? I grinned bitterly. And what about Holloway? You loved him too, didn't you? And Ramirez, and Stevens. It wasn't that. It was a mistake, a weakness. Weakness? Time after time? For years? Madame Dupre coughed delicately, approaching the table. More coffee? We both shook our heads. The rain intensified, turning the street into a blur outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again. What do you want me to do, Evelyn? I felt tired, endlessly tired. Forgotten? Forgive? Pretend it never happened? I want you to give us a chance. She reached across the table, but I pulled back. We could go to a marriage counselor. A lot of couples go through this. Through what? Through systematic cheating? Through years of lying? Through crisis? Through difficult times? Lawrence, please. I stood up. My legs felt like absorbent cotton, but I needed to leave. Right now, while I still had the strength left. You know what? I pulled out my wallet, placing the coffee money on the table. I really did love you, the woman I thought you were, who, as it turns out, never existed. Lawrence? No, I shook my head. I'm going to call my lawyer. He'll contact you about the paperwork. I walked out into the rain without looking back. Somewhere out there, behind the wet glass of the cafe, the woman I'd loved for 8 years was crying. Or thought I did. I can't tell now. I sat in the car for a long time, listening to the sound of rain on the roof. A message from Chris popped up on my phone. How'd it go? I didn't bother answering. What could I say? The rain was slowly subsiding. The sun broke through the thinning clouds, turning the puddles into mirrors. Life went on. Somewhere out there, in a parallel universe, There was another Lawrence Kingsley, who had never met Evelyn Porter. I wonder if he's happier. After meeting Evelyn, I couldn't go home. Just drove around the city, winding circles around familiar streets. Miami was getting ready for the evening. The lights of the restaurants were on. People were gathering on the beach with plaids and picnic baskets. Music was pouring out of the open doors of the bars. Just a normal Friday in a resort town. Somehow I ended up near the Ocean View Club, the same tennis club where I'd once met Evelyn. The security guard in the parking lot recognized my car and waved hello. How many times had I come here on Fridays, rushing to the court after work? How many times had Evelyn and I played here in mixed doubles? A familiar Porsche, Brad Holloway's car, was parked at the clubhouse entrance. I froze, unable to take my eyes off the silver hood. Of course, he's a member of the club too. How could I have forgotten? Evelyn had said he was transferring to Tampa, but apparently still here for now. The smart thing to do would be to leave. Just turn around and leave. Don't make a scene. Don't complicate things. But my feet took me to the front door. I guess somewhere inside there was hope that it was all a mistake, a bad dream, that something would clear up. The lobby smelled of chlorine from the pool and freshly ground coffee from the local cafe. On the wall hung a huge schedule of classes. I automatically found my usual time on Saturdays with my eyes. I wondered if I'd have to change my schedule to avoid running into them. The club's bar was on the second floor, overlooking the courts. Holloway sat at the counter, a glass of something amber in front of him. Whiskey, I guess. He always drank whiskey, I remembered from the rare club parties I'd been to. He didn't notice me right away. I was almost close before he turned around. Something akin to fear flashed across his face, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Mr. Kingsley," he nodded, clutching his glass a little harder than necessary. "So you're going to Tampa after all?" I sat down next to him, gesturing for the bartender to come over. "Double scotch, no ice." "Yeah, the transfer's already signed." Holloway was clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I understand how you must feel." "You do?" I grinned, accepting a glass from the bartender. "And how do you think I should feel, Dr. Holloway?" He wrinkled his nose. "Look, this was a mistake. We both realized that. Evelyn, she's a wonderful woman." "Oh yes, remarkable." I took a sip. "So remarkable that she couldn't limit herself to one lover. How many others did you know of?" Holloway froze, the glass frozen halfway to his lips. "What?" "Don't play innocent, doctor. Ramirez, Stevens, who else?" He slowly put the glass down. I mean, there were rumors, but I thought..." "That you're special? The only one?" I laughed bitterly. "Welcome to the club, Dr. Holloway." He looked genuinely shocked. "I wonder what it would be like to find out that you're not the only lover, but just another in a long string. That you're just as fooled as everyone else?" "I really didn't know." He finished his whiskey in a volley. "Thought there was something special between us. She said that your marriage was long dead." I interrupted him. "That I work too much? That she's lonely? Yeah, she has a knack for telling stories." Outside the window it got dark. The floodlights on the courts lit up. Somewhere downstairs, the thumping of the ball and the voices of the players could be heard. The evening shift was just beginning. "You know," Holloway twirled the empty glass in his hands. "When it all started, I felt awful. Lying to my wife, avoiding you guys at the club, and Evelyn said it was okay, that it wouldn't hurt anyone. And you believed it?" "Wanted to believe," he shrugged. "She's good at persuasion. Said you were hardly ever home, that your marriage only existed on paper." I stared at the drink in my glass. How many times had Evelyn told me she loved me? How many times had she planned our future, discussed buying a house in France, talked about how we would grow old together? And all the while, when did it start? With you? Holloway wrinkled his nose. "Last spring, a conference in Miami Beach. We ended up in the same hotel. I remembered that week. I'd been in London, closing an important deal. I called her every night, telling her how much I missed her. And she... That's funny." I finished my whiskey. "I brought her a Cartier bracelet back then. She was so happy, said I was the most attentive husband in the world." "I'm sorry." Holloway actually looked guilty. "If it means anything, I'm breaking my contract with the clinic. I'm leaving at the end of the week. Running? Call it what you want. I just can't stay here. After everything, the bartender came over with a bottle. More? We both shook our heads. That was enough for tonight. You know? Holloway stood up, pulling out his wallet. There's something I have to tell you. Evelyn, she was planning a divorce, even before you caught us. I froze. What? Consulted with a lawyer. Said she was tired of pretending, that she wanted to start a new life. He placed a few bills on the counter. Only now I realize I was just part of the plan, just like everyone else. He walked away, leaving me to digest this information. Divorce. She was planning a divorce. All the smiles, the kisses, the plans for the future. Was it all a lie? Preparation for the final act? I pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from Evelyn, 2 from Chris. I opened the gallery. Photos from our last vacation, just 2 months ago. The Maldives, the sunset, her smile. She'd already made up her mind then? Was she getting ready to leave? People were starting to gather at the bar. Friday night, time for cocktails and small talk. I recognized some of the faces. Club regulars, tennis partners. They said hello but kept their distance. News travels fast in a place like this. Stepping out onto the balcony, I looked out at the lighted courts. A couple of players were finishing a match, quite experienced, judging by their movements. Evelyn was playing well too. For a beginner, she'd said the first time I met her. A lie? Or was it the only truth? The phone vibrated again. A message from Chris. Are you okay? Not answering your phone. At the club, I texted. Met Holloway. Shit. Wait for me. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I didn't bother to reply. Just stood there, staring at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, in one of those houses, Evelyn was probably planning her new life right now. I wondered if she'd already picked out her next victim. Or was Holloway supposed to be the final act? In my pocket were Rolling Stones tickets, 2 tickets for the October concert. I pulled them out, scrutinizing them in the dim light. Evelyn had never liked their music. Was that a lie too? A pretense for the sake of making me happy while she prepared her exit? I heard a familiar voice downstairs. Chris was arguing with a security guard, trying to get in without a club card. I smiled weakly. Some things don't change. Some people stay true to themselves no matter what. Maybe that was the answer? Not to try to understand, not to look for explanations, but to just accept that some people are incapable of loyalty? That our whole life together was a skillfully staged play where I played the role of a loving husband, unaware of the existence of other actors? Chris insisted I return to tennis. Stop souring at home, he said, showing up at my place Saturday morning with a new racket in hand. I signed us up for another club, Palm Beach Tennis Center. No familiar faces, no memories. Palm Beach greeted us with manicured courts and a fresh ocean breeze. Everything was different here, from the color of the walls to the layout of the courts. No reminders of the past, no ghosts of happy days with Evelyn. We have doubles, Chris said as we changed in the locker room. I hope you haven't learned how to play during these weeks of voluntary seclusion. Our partners were already waiting on the court. A tall man in his 60s with a military bearing. Jack Summers, retired colonel, and a woman in an off-white tennis uniform. Elizabeth Sutherland, she introduced herself, extending her hand. But everyone calls me Betty. There was something special about her. Maybe the direct look in her green eyes, or the slight half-smile, as if she knew some secret. She was in her early 50s, but age only added to her charm. Lawrence Kingsley, I shook her hand. You can just call me Larry. Oh, so you're the Rolling Stones fan? She laughed, noticing my surprise. Chris told me. I have all their albums on vinyl, by the way, including the rare Japanese editions. The game was on. Betty proved to be a strong partner. Accurate serves, confident strokes, great sense of position. She and I had played against Chris and Jack, and for the first time in a long time I felt the excitement, the desire to win. Your backhand is impressive, she said during a break, handing me a bottle of water. How long have you been playing? About 20 years, although the last month has been a break, she nodded understandingly. I know how it is. After my divorce, I couldn't pick up a racket for a year. Too many memories. I looked at her more closely. Her eyes read the same knowledge of pain I saw every morning in the mirror. How did you... when did it get easier? When I stopped pretending everything was okay, she smiled. You know what the hardest part about betrayal is? Not the pain itself, but having to pretend you're okay. Smiling in public, answering the questions on duty. We won the match, 7-5 in the last set. Betty turned out to be not only a great player, but also a pleasant conversationalist. After the game, she suggested we have coffee in the club cafe. Not here, she said, noticing my glance toward the clubhouse. I know a great place 2 blocks from here. They make a real Italian espresso there. Cafe Piccolo turned out to be a tiny establishment tucked away in the shade of old banyan trees. A vintage coffee machine puffed and hissed, filling the room with the aroma of freshly ground beans. Old photographs of Miami from the 50s hung on the walls. I found this place by accident, Betty said as we settled at a table by the window. Wandered around the city trying to pick myself back up after my divorce. Sometimes you have to get lost to find something new. She told her story. 15 years of marriage, a businessman husband, a double life she'd discovered by accident. A familiar story. All too familiar. The funny thing is, she stirred her coffee with a small silver spoon. I tried to forgive too, didn't I? Thought I could start over, forget, pretend it never happened. But you know what? You can't glue a broken trust back together. It's like a broken mirror. Even if you pick up all the pieces, the reflection will never be the same again. I watched the sunbeam play in her reddish hair. There was a kind of quiet wisdom about her, an acceptance of life as it was. How did you cope? I asked. With the pain, with the betrayal? Day by day, she shrugged. Found new hobbies. Started collecting vinyl, for example. Opened an art gallery. Always dreamed of having my own business, but my husband thought it was a waste of time. I learned to live for myself, not for anyone else. We talked for several hours. She talked about her contemporary art gallery, about traveling, about concerts she'd been to. I caught myself for the first time in a long time, really listening instead of just nodding out of politeness. You know what? She said suddenly, looking at her watch. There's a new exhibition opening at my gallery next week. Contemporary sculpture, very unusual. And then a small buffet with live music. Come. I promise, no talk of exes, just art and good wine. I hesitated. Social events had never been my strong suit, especially now. Also, she pulled a business card out of her purse. I hear you have Rolling Stones tickets. If you ever need the company of someone who really understands their music. She smiled, openly, without coquetry or pretense. Just a friendly offer, just a chance to not be alone. Thanks, I took the business card. For playing, for talking, for understanding. I watched her walk away, confident gait, straight back, no pretense or desire to impress. Just a woman who'd been through the pain and come out stronger. Chris appeared as if out of nowhere. How's it going? How's what? Betty. I didn't pick this club by accident, you know. She went through similar shit a couple years ago. Thought you might find it useful. Manipulative, I grinned, but without anger. Just taking care of a friend, he shrugged. She's really good at music, by the way, and her gallery is one of the best in town. You know what? I said, tucking the business card away in my wallet. I think I'm going to go to that exhibit. I set up a meeting with Evelyn at Le Petit Jardin, the place where it all started a few weeks ago. This time, I chose a table in the garden. There was no point in hiding from the memories. They were everywhere anyway. But now their sting was dulled, less painful. She was right on time. A habit that had once seemed so sweet to me. She was wearing a simple blue dress, the same one I'd first met her in at the tennis club. A coincidence or a deliberate choice? Now I wasn't sure about anything about Evelyn anymore. You look different, she said, taking a seat. I could hear the surprise in her voice. Different? Calmer, more confident. Madame Dupré materialized at the table with her invariable notebook. We both ordered only coffee. Some traditions don't change. I was meeting with Holloway, I said as the waitress stepped aside. Evelyn flinched, but I continued. And I know about the lawyer, about your divorce plans. She lowered her eyes. I should have told you sooner. Yes, you should have. Just like you should have told me about Ramirez and Stevens and everyone else. Lawrence. No. Let me finish. I held up my hand. You know what the most amazing thing is? I'm not angry anymore. I really don't. I'm just tired. Tired of wondering what was true and what was a lie. Tired of trying to figure out where the real you is and where the mask is. Coffee came in dainty china cups. Evelyn added milk 1 spoonful, as always. Such a familiar gesture, but now it evoked nothing but a slight sadness. I loved you, she said quietly. In my own way, but I loved you. Do you know what the worst part of betrayal is? I watched the cloud of milk dissolve into the coffee. Not the betrayal itself. It's that it makes you question everything, every moment, every memory. I'm sorry. She reached across the table, but I didn't move. Really sorry. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. And you know what? Maybe it was meant to be. Maybe it was the only way for both of us to be free. She looked up. Tears glistened in her eyes. You really think so? Yes. We were both living an illusion, Evelyn. You pretended to be a happy wife. I pretended not to notice your double life. It's time to end it. Birds chirped in the garden. Music played somewhere in the distance. An ordinary day in Miami. The world continued to spin. What now? She asked. Now we let each other go. No drama, no accusations. Just letting go. She nodded, blotting her eyes with a tissue. You're right. It's about time we did this. My lawyer will contact you next week. Don't worry about the house. You can have everything you want. Stuff, furniture, it doesn't matter anymore. And your record collection? I'm only keeping the Rolling Stones. I smiled weakly. Their concert is tonight, by the way. I know. You've been dreaming about it for so long. Yeah, I have. I finished my coffee. You know what's funny? I bought those tickets thinking it was going to be our special night. And now I realize it really is a special night, just in a different way. We parted at the entrance to the cafe. No hugs, no tears, just a quiet goodbye and the realization that this conversation was our last. It was a busy evening outside the stadium. Betty was waiting at the entrance with her friends, a small group of the same rock and roll connoisseurs. She was wearing that promised 73 tour t-shirt, and she was glowing with anticipation like a child. Ready for a legend? She handed me a cup of coffee. They say they're going to start with Start Me Up. The concert was everything I'd dreamed of, and more. Mick Jagger, the timeless Mick Jagger, had the crowd going from the first chords. Keith Richards worked magic on guitar, and the stadium exploded with every familiar riff. When the intro to Wild Horses came on, I felt something finally let go inside. Betty was singing along softly, and there was more understanding of the music in her voice than in all the conversations I'd had with Evelyn about the Rolling Stones. Wild Horses couldn't drag me away. I looked at the stage, at the thousands of cell phone lights that turned the stadium into a starry sky, and thought about how strange life is. Sometimes you have to lose something important to find something real. Sometimes the end is just a new beginning. Are you okay? Betty touched my arm. More than okay, I smiled. You know, I finally feel free. Satisfaction blasted the air with a familiar riff, and the stadium exploded with it. We sang and danced like teenagers at their first concert, with no regard for age or status. Just people united by the music and the moment.